it's you
Mister.
again. Welcome back.
Excuse me, mister. Mister, this is the wrong camera angle.
Oh, hi. I'm Marc. I used to be a senior artist at Blizzard Entertainment, and now I teach art for a living. In this new episode of my weekly series that I call YouTube Art School, I'm going to show you the steps to paint beautiful, stylized figures without a line art. So, if you're more of a painter and less of a drawer, let me show you my simple art recipe for painting bodies so that you can start impressing your friends. What the? Uh-oh, quickly, let's get this class started! Alright, class is in session. Pay attention. In recent weeks, I've been focusing a lot on line art, but I know there are many of you out there who prefer the more painterly approach to art. I'm also part of that group. All the old videos that I used to post on the channel were speed paints done on a single layer. I find it's a more expressive and forgiving way to create art, so today I'll show you my process for painting female bodies, or just bodies in general, I guess. If you're a complete beginner, this might be a little bit overwhelming, but guaranteed you'll still learn something. Let's get it. First step, number 1, we begin with the construction. Just like with a line drawing, construction comes as the first step of the process because we're trying to get something down on the canvas without investing ourselves too much into it. It's meant to be a quick step where you can brainstorm a few different poses until you land on a silhouette that you like. Obviously, if you have no idea what pose to give to your character, it helps to just start and try different things. The worst is just staring at a blank canvas hoping a good idea is gonna pop in your head. Just get started and iterate, but also don't hesitate to look for references, especially if you want to improve. No references, no learning. I like to choose a mid-tone for the skin color, or just go with a mid-gray, that works too, if you don't want to bother with colors just yet. And with a big, bold brush, I lay down the rough silhouette while thinking about the rough muscle groups of the body. You can see I press harder for shapes that are meant to be on top or in front of others, and lighter for shapes that are farther in the distance, like the arm there. This helps give the silhouette a little bit more information, and I think it just reads better that way. Also, sometimes the shade change is only meant to visually separate different parts, like the torso from the legs here. So quickly, let's look at the proportions here, since that's really the whole point of this initial step. Most of my characters will be 7 to 8 heads tall, so that would be the first thing that we want to paint, our unit of measurement, the head. From there, the main reference point I think about is the crotch, which typically will split the total height of a standing character in equal halves. In reality, most of us have shorter legs, but I always prefer ideal over average when I paint. But you do whatever you want. You could also look at the elbows and have them kind of line up with the belly button when the arms are just resting on the side of the body. The upper arm and the forearm are also basically the same length seen from the back, so it's just easy to remember as being the same length. But we have a little extra length on top of that in the lower arm, thanks to the hand, which is typically about 2/3 the length of the forearm. And like I was saying before, when the arm is hanging down like that, it should comfortably be able to cup your crotch. What? Because otherwise the length is probably wrong. To measure the legs, I already know the total length, so it's only a matter of finding the knees, and once again you can kind of put those right down the center. But really they're a little bit lower than that. It just makes it easy to remember. And now that we have some good silhouettes and decent proportions, time to move on to the next step and tighten this up a little bit more. Alright, I call the next step silhouette sculpting because that's exactly what I'll be doing here. There isn't much now, but I think the poses are pretty clear already. All they need is a little bit more definition and structure. It's time to whip out those anatomy skills and focus on the different things that will impact the surface of the body, and the silhouette of course. So we'll look at the skeleton, the muscles, and the fat a little bit. Starting with the bones here as the frame for the body. There are a few notable ones that not only impact the silhouette, but also happen to be great reference points to help us make sure that everything is in place. Let's quickly go through them. So from the top here, we have the clavicles, a pair of S-curved bones starting at the sternum and ending on top of the shoulders there. The tip of the clavicles, along with the scapula or the shoulder blade in the back, come together to form the socket, for the humerus, the bone of the upper arm. In the forearm, we have the ulna, which helps create the elbow bump, what makes our elbow pointy. And if you look on the outside of your wrist, on the side of your pinky, you'll notice a little bit of a bump there. Well, that would be the radius, the second bone for the forearm. Back on the torso, I mentioned the sternum already, and that's of course attached to the rib cage. And we can see hints of that already here on my sketch. Below that is just going to be the abdomen, so no superficial bones there until we reach the hip bones. So that area typically looks a little bit more sunken in. A lot of stuff attaches on the hips, so it's a particularly important part of the body. From the front, it kind of has this heart shape to it. Then from there, we're going to find the femur. And just like with the forearm, our lower legs also feature two bones, the tibia on the inside, what you're going to feel when you touch the front of your lower leg, and the fibula on the outside, stopping a little lower than the tibia and also creating a bump on the side of the ankles. I guess I can also go back and mention the patella or the kneecap, since it does impact the look of the knees a little bit. I'm also able to sculpt the silhouette at this point because I'm thinking of all the main muscle groups as I paint and how those attach to the bones. References here will come in very handy if you're not super familiar with anatomy. But notable groups of muscle that impact the silhouette a lot would be things like the deltoids, the latissimus dorsi in the back, the pectoralis, the abs, the glutes, the quads, hamstrings in the back of the leg, on the arm, the biceps, the triceps, and the flexor and extensor muscles for both the forearm and the lower leg. And all of that should be a great starting point. If you're not sure where to start while learning anatomy, start there. Now, if you want to make your characters fatter, for women, most of the fat will accumulate around these areas. And it's only slightly different from men, as you can see. Keep in mind that fat lays on top of the muscle, so it will tend to get rid of a lot of the details. I prefer when there are more details because it's harder, so I didn't add any here, but just FYI. I covered a lot of stuff fairly quickly, but if you want more of an in-depth video on drawing different body types and what makes them work, check out my class on drawing various body types. Link in the top right corner of the screen and down below. Now let's move on to shading. Always using a soft brush. I'm watching you. At this point, I have a pretty flat silhouette with some anatomy landmarks, so let's add some shading on here, but focusing on the darker colors. Highlights and lights will come next. The actual color that you use is still pretty irrelevant. You can just use a darker version of the color that you've been using so far. When shading, I always focus on the deepest, darkest areas first. Details around the armpits, the crotch, under the chin, any skin fold, that kind of stuff. Then I'll make my way to the rest of the body, but going at it very lightly. It's a personal preference, but I tend to prefer when the majority of the surfaces look kind of flat with only hints of shading. Still, when you have clear geometric shapes, like the cylinder shapes of the limbs, the half spheres on the shoulders and the chest, you must add some shading. Otherwise, it's gonna look like poo-poo. No need to imagine a light or anything like that though. Just think of it in this way. All the surfaces that are facing you most directly should be lighter. Others that are facing away, like the sides of the cylinder here, painted darker. Just doing that should allow you to shade at least like 80% of your whole character. But once again, I have a complete guide on how to shade, so have a look if that's a skill that you need help with. Link up top here and down below again. Now though, we're ready to focus on colors. Most of the work is done. The first thing that you'll want to do is to tint your painting the skin color of your choice if you've been painting in grayscale up until now, because we're about to work on the skin complexion and more subtle color variations. Still, we're gonna keep it pretty simple here and just add a bit more red in the areas our skin is thinner, or where we have more blood vessels, or just where more melanin, our natural skin pigment, tends to accumulate more. Let's see the difference here without and with. Boom! Wow, you can see the changes on the elbows and the knees more specifically, and the extremities also a little bit, like the fingers and the toes. Very subtle, but it makes the character feel a little bit more alive. And while it might not be super obvious on these characters, it's still an important step, so don't skip it. And then moving on to lights, and we're almost done. While everything so far has been done on the same layer, I do recommend keeping the lights separate. It's just easier to work that way. I just pop a new layer on top, set it to overlay mode, and paint with a light yellow. Imagining a light source coming from the top right-ish, here in my case. When painting body with light, you'll want to ignore all the details that you see on the character and instead try to see simple volumes, just like we did while shading. Imagine those volumes are what you're painting the light on. Again, abstracting away most of the surface details and just keeping it super simple. Here, I'm really just shading a bunch of cylinders. Piece of cake. To make this step easier, you can also just imagine that the light is coming straight from above. At least for me, it feels easier to imagine. And technically, you could have a bunch of lights in here, but I think a single one here works pretty well. Because it's starting to look quite good with lights on. See the difference when we turn them off? Nice. But not nice enough. The final trick with light is to add a saturated terminator, the name for the light transition when it goes from light to shadow. Skin looks like skin because the terminator is always going to be tinted the color of the subcutaneous layer, the layer under the skin. In this case, muscles or blood. Red. Here in Photoshop, I can do this process super quickly by adding a layer style. Inner glow on the light layer with the color set to hard light is what I usually recommend. It looks good. It could definitely be a little bit more detailed, but let's move on to the final step, a mini step, and let's add gloss. Subtle reflections on the skin, because skin is mildly reflective. I have it as a final step, but that could come before lights actually, it doesn't matter much. Here, all I'll be doing is adding a low opacity white reflection on the body, where the skin will be the tightest, since that's when the light reflection will be more obvious. Things like the thighs, the front of our tibia, since it's pretty pointy, the shoulders, and any area where the skin is stretched more. It's a small change, but in some cases, especially when you choose not to add light, that's going to make your character pop a lot more, instead of looking all matte and dry. Ugh. But yeah, that's it. I could still render this for a while to make it look more polished, but I think this shows that you can get something nice relatively quickly with some practice. And that's going to wrap it up for this week's class. I hope you'll try painting some bodies this weekend. It's quite fun. If you made it until the end of the class, to congratulate you, you can go ahead and download one of my 2 custom brush sets. It's for Photoshop, but from what I've seen, you can get it to work nicely in Procreate and Clip Studio Paint too. Most of the brushes that I use today can be found in a pack. Wow. Check the video description for the download link. Also, if you like how I teach, for you guys on YouTube only, I have a big discount on my complete art education program until the end of the month. The price will go up a little bit next month, so make sure that you use the coupon in the description to get a big chunk of the full price. And have fun learning. Make sure that you turn on notifications and come back next week for a new angle.